This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Good afternoon. It seems like such a short time ago, but 20 years have passed this spring, summer, and fall since the Oslo Accord, or the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements, were signed in that dramatic event in the Rose Garden of the White House with Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton. We all remember that, or many of us do. The Oslo Accord was predicated upon an understanding that the process would culminate with two states, Palestine and Israel, living alongside one another. But in the past 2 decades, that two-state solution has been challenged in both national communities and their supporters abroad. In the 1970s and early 1980s, there was a lone Israeli voice, Meron Ben-Venisti, who believed that it was already far too late for such a solution, namely a two-state solution. And he would routinely speak of, we are only 5, 4, or 3, or 2 minutes from midnight. And of course, midnight was that moment that is irreversible. But recently, Ben-Venisti, who had that position so long ago, has written that it is now essential for both peoples to discuss seriously the viability of the two-state solution. In order to pursue that here, we have invited David Makovsky and Rafe al-Omari to take up the issue with us. David Makovsky, as you know, is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Project on the Middle East Peace Process at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And he is also the author of several books and research studies. Perhaps the most important for our discussion this afternoon is his Imagining the Borders, Options for Resolving the Israeli-Palestinian Territorial Issue. Rafe al-Omari is the executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine, and he has previously served in various positions within the Palestinian Authority, including being a senior advisor to then former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas, as well as a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation. They have been working very hard with our students over the past 3 days, as Leonard indicated. They've been speaking in my course on the religion and politics of Jerusalem. They've been helping our students in a kind of laboratory situation that helps them to gain insight into the dynamics of peace negotiation. And they have been involved with our students in a series of Jewish-Muslim religious dialogues. This tripartite programmatic structure, if I can call it that, was created here 4 years ago. And we pursued it last year. And some of you may remember that at the end of their visit, we had a discussion in which we brought students, along with David and Rafe, for something that we called Report from Jerusalem. Leonard has told me that that tape, or that DVD, has been downloaded 310,000 times by people accessing the University of California TV We had the great fortune last year of having several students who have now gone on to graduate and begin their professional lives. But today we have joining David and Rafe 2 undergraduate students. One, Nadine Hussein, who is to the left of David, is a senior graduating in June with a double major in global and international studies and religious studies. I believe Nadine participated last year in Report from Jerusalem, and I'm just absolutely delighted that you are willing to participate again. Next to him, and this is very interesting, is this young man, Jake Spire. And you would look at him and you might say, well, he's a senior like Nadine. But he isn't. He's a freshman majoring in economics. And so I'm so thankful that the 2 of you were willing to participate in this discussion. So please join me now in welcoming David Makovsky and Rafe al-Omari, Nadine and Jake, who will speak on the issue of the Israel-Palestine achieving a 2-state solution.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon. It's always a delight to come back, and I want to thank Leonard and Richard and everyone at the Taubman Symposia for bringing us out here again. It's a delight to be back with you. People think you got to be a masochist to work on this issue. It's so, everyone's got a view. There's too much heat. There's too little light. People are so passionate about this question. Why would you want to throw yourself into this? I worked on these maps because I wanted to demystify this issue and try to look for constructive solutions towards bringing an end to this tragic conflict which has gone on for so many decades. And people say, isn't it hopeless that everyone is intertwined? How are you going to get a 2-state solution out of this? And there's different views of the past. How did we get here? We could all agree the UN partition plan of 1947, 2 states for 2 peoples, but it turned in different ways. And the Israelis accepted their half. The Palestinians thought the whole thing was illegitimate, the way it was done by the UN. There was a war in 1948, and the people who took over the West Bank were the Jordanians. Then there was the 1967 war, and Israel, faced by Arab enemies, then won the West Bank. And now we're in the 7th day of the 6-day war since 1967, which is, what do you do now? And the Jordanians bowed out. First in 1974, they came back in. They bowed out again in 1988. They said, you Israelis and Palestinians, you're on your own. You got to sort it out. We're out of this. Big breakthrough came on the White House lawn with a handshake between Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat in 1993 that Richard alluded to. We're now in the 20th anniversary of that accord, which was to reconcile the 2 national movements, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization representing the Palestinian national movement. So the question is, what do you do? And they started out gingerly, and they have not solved it. It's gone backwards a lot. It looked like in 2000 we might be close to a resolution. But now we're in a situation that we still have not had a resolution of the territory, security, Jerusalem, and the issue of refugees. So what I wanted to do by doing these maps was to demystify the territorial piece. Everyone said, oh, this is top secret, you can't get into all this. And what I felt was, if we demystified this issue, people would at least have a more educated sort of discussion. And we wouldn't be debating abstractions. And being on the campus here for the last 3 days, I think it's been very illuminating about how the students relate to maps, because that's usually not part of their discussion. I'm not here to, quiz you on all these details. You probably can't even see it so well. But the West Bank is this area here. This is what we call the green line, the pre-1967 boundary over here. The Gaza Strip, you probably heard about in the news, is down over here. There's like 30 miles between those two places. Here's places you may have heard of. You know, there's Jerusalem. You can see Tel Aviv and Haifa. But the point is that the question here is, you've got 2.2 million Palestinians in that West Bank, and you've got about 350,000 Jewish settlers. So how do you make a two-state solution out of this? Aren't they all kind of all mixed in together? Isn't it one big soup? Isn't it hopeless? And many of you are looking at the map and say, yeah, it looks hopeless to me. But what Rafe and I, have been working this issue from different angles, believe it's not hopeless. And the key to understanding why it's not hopeless is to understand on this territorial dimension, which we say is not the whole issue, but it is a key piece of solving this problem, is there a way to disentangle these two populations without displacement on a large scale? For Israel, there's a concern that is about security, that here's the Jordan River. The eastern perimeter of a Palestinian state would be this Jordan Valley. The country called Jordan is on the other side of the river. And Israel fears that when they got out of Gaza in 2005, if you see my pointer laser pen here, that when they left Gaza, an outer perimeter of a Palestinian area, that the number of tunnels, about 300 tunnels, kind of proliferated, and that Iranian rockets have come in and hitting Israeli urban areas. The Israeli fear is, if you didn't like the book in Gaza, why would you see the movie in the West Bank? So the question is, what could you do on security? This whole area of the Sinai-Gaza border is like 12 kilometers. Here's 80 kilometers. So how do you avert smuggling to make sure that the Gaza situation isn't repeated? Then the Israeli withdrawal, instead of it being land for peace, when you withdraw, you're more secure, that it's more land for rockets, land for vulnerability, and that, there's something that people don't want to repeat. So there's a security element to this. And there's also a security element of Israel wanting to make sure that rockets don't go from Hamas to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. But then there's the territorial piece, which is, what do you do with the settlers? And the piece of good news in all this is that 80% of the settlers, of this 350,000, live largely in 5% of the West Bank. And now we'll go to map 1. And Rafe is going to show you map 4. It's very important that you understand that we are neither wedded to any given map per se. We just want this to be, we are just keen that there be a menu for decision makers. And I was kind of stunned in talking about this to people, to policymakers on a senior level, that homework had not been done because it was deemed so politically super sensitive that to draw a map, even inside a government, might lead to the collapse of the government if the map leaked. So there were no maps, and people had not done the work. The key here was, I think, in this map, and the other 3, I did 3 maps altogether, and Rafe was involved in an exercise called Geneva, which got a lot of world publicity. Whatever map you choose, the 2 pieces to remember are this: that both of us would like to see a situation that the Palestinians could come back to give a victory speech to their people and to say, we netted out 100% of the land, and we got 100% of the land, just like Anwar Sadat got 100% of the Sinai Desert when he made his trip. Now, there'll be some people who are critics and say, who cares? Why should they make that victory statement? Sadat risked his life. He was assassinated for it by making that historic trip. There was no Palestinian state before 1967. But my feeling was that this should not just be about a bargain. It should be about a sense that both sides have to go home to their publics at the end of the night. So you want a situation that there is not massive social unrest in Israel by massive dislocation, and at the same time, on the Palestinian side, that they could say there's something called land exchanges or land swaps. President Obama introduced this idea in a speech, 2 speeches he gave in May 2011. He didn't explain what land swaps were, so people thought it was a Wall Street term of some sort when he talked about swaps. But the truth was, it would be like if you see that orange area up there, or you would see orange areas here, or orange areas here. So the key in the map is the creativity, is to try to say, okay, with less than 5% of this land, and by the way, when we say this land, we're talking about 6,195 square kilometers is the total of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, a quadrant of the Dead Sea, this area over here. So it's to say, for 5% of that, Israel in these areas, and right on the outskirts of Jerusalem here, to the south, to the east, to the north, that for that 5% that Israel keeps, Israel gives. So it's a land exchange, a land swap. You don't displace 80% of the people, but that everyone gets to go home with their victory speech. The Palestinians say, I netted out 100% of the land of the West Bank. It might not be the same pieces of sand from 1967, but even Yasser Arafat admitted that there would be some swaps, but at least we could go back and say that. Now, and Israel could say, for the 80% of the people who have been in limbo, they don't know what their legal status. They're Israeli citizens, but their land is in limbo because people don't know, or is it inside the tent or outside the tent, that Israel is able to say that 80% is upgraded, that 5% of the land where the 80% settlers live, they are now part of the state of Israel, but in return, equal amount of land for swaps. That's the core concept. Now you can say, what about the remaining 20%? And that could be 60,000 people. That could be even actually a little more right now. Many of them are kids. But the idea is to say that they have a chance to move to these, what we call blocks in this purple area. So the rest of that 95% is Palestine. Israel will have security arrangements along the river to avert smuggling. The land link will be done so rockets are not transferred. There's 100 details we could discuss in the discussion, but I just want to conclude with this point. The point is to say, when you're dealing with the reality of the conflict as it is today, not as we wish it to be, and not as it is in college debates about who was right before 1948, we're trying to deal with the 21st century. We want to find a situation that the past does not bury the future, and that you provide dignity for both sides so that they can both say that we have 2 states for 2 people, and this tragic conflict of decades, that this tragedy is brought to an end. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, David, for the presentation. Before I start, I would really like to thank, first of all, Leonard. His tenacity and his insistence has made this possible and had made this experience so rich for us. And of course, Richard, for hosting us graciously over the years and for the kind introduction. And also, I would like to thank you for being here. I mean, sometimes the news from the ground and the mood about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is so frustrating and so depressing that I'm surprised and, of course, heartened when I see people actually show up and are interested in the issue. Now, before I go into the maps and into all of the details of what we've been doing, I want to put us with a bit of a reality check. I want to start with a bit of a reality check. We will be talking about negotiations, and indeed, in my view, negotiations are the only way that you can resolve the conflict, the only way that you can determine the final borders, the only way you can deal with the difficult issues like Jerusalem, refugees, security, etc., etc. However, if you take that and juxtapose it to what's happening on the ground today, there is a dissonance. If you've been following the news over the last few days, we hopefully, I can't say it with certainty, have just averted what could have been a major disaster in the region. Things are very volatile on the ground. Both people are losing hope with the realizability of a 2-state solution. Both peoples are still very committed to the idea, but very few people think that it is achievable. And I'm afraid that in nations like it is among individuals, When the desirable and the possible are so far, at some point you abandon the desirable. And I'm afraid that we are at a moment where people might be abandoning the very hope of a two-state solution. So in my view, at this moment, the urgency is not to jump into negotiations. We need to get there, but I don't think this is the time. The urgency right now is to start changing reality on the ground. I think today we have an opportunity, and opportunities that did not exist 5 years ago. The degree of security cooperation and trust between the Palestinian security sector and the IDF, the Israeli military, is unprecedented to an extent that the IDF now, in my view, has become the biggest advocate for Palestinians in the Israeli system. Kind of counterintuitive, but that is the reality. We can build on that to start showing both peoples that there is hope of change and movement. Yet, I think it's very important for those of us who are engaging in this issue to sometimes zoom out from today's reality. If you get too fixated on reality, your view of the future, hope, and all of these necessary components become so mired in today's reality that you forget what you're working for. And we feel that it's very important to regularly remind people that a two-state solution is possible and it is desirable. We've looked at the maps, as David mentioned, not as gospel, not as Bible, not as the Quran. These are not holy positions. David had his map that he presented. I'm going to present a different map right now. As David said, neither of us is particularly wedded to our map. This is our individual read of what a desirable map for our side or the side that we identify with would look like. However, as far as I'm concerned, any map the two sides agree on and can sell to their public is good enough for me. Because, again, this happens often in the peace process and in discussing this issue. We sometimes tend to forget that peace and what comes with peace and the normality and the stability that will come with peace is much more important than a bit here and a bit there. And I've seen it in my own career as a negotiator. Sometimes a detail that in the big picture is really not that important delays you from reaching the ultimate objective. So in that regard, I think David and I both believe that, we're trying to do this as a contribution, yet at the end of the day, whatever they agree, it's good enough for me. This conflict needs to end. This is the bottom line as far as I'm concerned. This map, if I may have this, is a map, as David mentioned, we came up with during a process called the Geneva Initiative. It was an informal set of negotiations between former officials who were themselves in the past negotiators. I'm not a maps expert, I'm a lawyer, so I don't fully understand how mapping works, but from a Palestinian perspective, the less land that Israel annexes, the easier it is to sell a map. For the Palestinian narrative, of course, is that all of the West Bank is ours and it's legally ours and all settlers are illegal, but it's very clear from the beginning, from almost pre-Camp David, that no Israeli prime minister, even the most left forward-oriented one, can afford or can possibly remove 350,000 now. So for the sake of reaching a deal, you come up with the concept of a land swap. For the Palestinians, the main interests in any map deal is that the lands that Israel will take, first of all, do not affect Palestinian contiguity and viability so that the Palestinian can go up north and south with reasonable ease. Does not affect Palestinian vital interests, whether they are related to security or natural resources or what have you. And ultimately, end up with a map that looks kind of presentable. You can give it to your kids at their first grade and say, draw this map. Nothing too Swiss cheesy there. The main issues that the Palestinians had with the map that David presented was the area of Ariel. This is the one, right?
Yeah.
Which juts too deeply into the Palestinian territory and make contiguity difficult. The problem with Ariel, of course, is that it's a huge settlement with tens of thousands or thousands of residents. So it's very difficult. And it's really a city, more or less, now. So this is one issue that will continue to be contentious, and I personally cannot predict how it's going to fall in the future. Then there are some issues in terms of settlements around Ramallah and Jerusalem. The idea here being that you cannot have settlements surrounding major Palestinian population centers in a way that makes it impossible for Ramallah, which is the financial, commercial, cultural capital of Palestine, to expand, or for Jerusalem, the future Palestinian state, the future Palestinian capital, to expand. Beyond this, though, these are issues that are not random. These are issues that reflect each side's interest, and these are issues that the negotiators will have to grapple with. The ultimate arbiter on this, I believe, is going to be what either side believes their public opinion is willing to accept. It's more of a political issue right now than it is a technical mapping issue. And I think what David did, one of the huge contributions of this exercise, is that it laid out for many of the policymakers the kind of options that they would have, and let them choose. Now, the reason why David did this, the reason that we did Geneva and other initiatives that others did, like Ayalon and Sari Nusayba and others, is to show that a two-state solution is still possible. And there are ways of doing it. Now, why are we so invested in a two-state solution? Many of you have probably heard that two-state solution is dead, has been dead for a while, let's move on. Well, first of all, I don't believe it's dead. And we can talk about it more in a bit, but I think a two-state solution, in my view, in some ways, there's a moral imperative to the two-state solution. What you have, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is a conflict of two peoples, each of which has a morally credible narrative and a morally credible connection to the land, and a political and identity need to exercise their identities through creating their own states. The Jewish people, as a nation, has the right to self-determination. The Jewish connection to the land is undeniable. And so the Jewish people, the Zionists, have a very acceptable moral claim on the land. Equally, the Palestinians. They are a people, self-identified, with a very clear connection to the land, and a need to exercise their identity through the creation of their own state. As Palestinians, I can speak as a Palestinian and a former official, I can say that we have never had a chance to actually be masters of our own fate. Whether as a minority in Israel, whether as a numerical majority but a political minority in Jordan, whether as an occupied people in the West Bank in Gaza, there was never the chance to actually realize fully our identity through exercising our self-determination. I think for the health of the Palestinian national identity, we need our state. The idea of a one-state option might sound good, where Muslim and Jew, Arab and Israeli all hold hands and sing Kumbaya together, is morally maybe appealing at some level, yet it presupposes the impossible. It presupposes a post-ethnic nationalism kind of world, and we're not there. Europe is not there. The Middle East is not there. I don't see us as there. So for me, the only available option is a two-state solution, and any other alternative is a recipe for the continuation of the conflict. It's not something that I wish for my own, the people that I identify with, and neither do I for the Israeli people, who will be the inevitable permanent neighbors of the Palestinians. This issue of the two-state solution and the viability and the credibility and the buy-in to the two-state solution, from my experience, and I suspect from David's experience as well, maybe comes at most stress, and comes at most, if you wish, is most endangered, if that's the right word, on campuses. In some ways, those of us in the policy community in Washington and even in the region, we work together every day. We have the same frames of reference. We've assumed that this is a given, the two-state solution, the quest for it. Our experience in many, not only the two-state solution, but the dialogue that comes with it. Our experience on many campuses, and I'm glad to say that this is not one of those campuses, but on many campuses, this issue is so toxic. The nature of the conversation is such that there is not a conversation. It's a set of finger-pointing, delegitimization, trying to undermine the other, their legitimacy and their credibility, and we believe that is dangerous. It is dangerous to have a whole generation grow up destined to make the same mistake that our generation did. So, as guys who find their comfort zone in our own little Washington environment, we have been doing this now for over more than 40 campuses, going to campuses and try to show that you can be pro-Israel without being anti-Palestinian, and you can be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Israeli. This trip, we tried to take this into to the Santa Barbara. We tried to kind of take this beyond, the kind of one big lecture and then we parachute back to Washington. We tried to do this simulated negotiation exercise. We had many objectives. One is educational. We are at a university at the end of the day. And as David mentioned, it is shocking to me how passionate many people are about this issue, yet how ill-informed many people are about this issue. It's amazing. So we decided to take students who are self-identified as being pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian and actually teach them the substance of what we're talking about. What does borders mean? What does refugees mean? What are the issues surrounding Jerusalem? But also to teach them some of the issues about how to negotiate, which in my view is a skill that's good as a diplomat, but also as a human being. Particularly, that the way that this issue is often approached is in a very emotional way, what we call position-driven negotiations. I demand 100%. I'm only going to give you 50%. How about 95%? Okay, I'll make it 60%. It kind of reminds me, for any of you who've been in the old city of Jerusalem, of trying to buy something in the souk there. It's very difficult to describe, but it's not rational. We try to introduce to them the idea of an interest-based negotiations. Before you tell me what you want from territory, tell me what are your interests. So when David said security and not removing settlers, okay, I understand why he says he wants 10%. There's a logic there. I can find logical ways to accommodate some of his concerns and interests, and equally with mine. We started the exercise, before we even got into this, with a very basic question. Why a two-state solution? We often look at peace as something that we give to the other, as a gift we give to the other. We asked our students to actually each look at what is their interest in reaching peace. Define it, not as a charity to other, but why do you need peace? We then decided to split them. Those who are pro-Israeli were playing the Palestinian negotiators, those who were pro-Palestinian playing the Israeli negotiators, to give them a sense of the complexity of the issue, and to get them an understanding of the sets of the issues. But before we got there, we asked them a difficult question, and a question that might not be very politically correct, but it is there in the mind of every negotiator and policymaker. If I don't like the negotiation process, what are my options? What if I walk out? What options do I have? Violence, unilateralism, continuation of the status quo, etc., etc. And I think my view from this, we realize that there are no alternatives. So we have to make very difficult compromises. We try to get the students to deal with two different sets of categories of issues. One category is the very practical, rational issues. Borders. Here are my interests, here are your interests. Let's see how we can draw them on a map. A very rational, cold conversation. Yet a very educational one in seeing how you can be creative. The idea of land swaps. How I can say I got 100% and you can say you got what you wanted. The second set of issues we try to deal with, which are frankly much more complicated, are the narrative issues. I asked my Palestinian team, the students who are self-identified in real life as pro-Israel, to write what is, in their view, the Palestinian narrative about what happened in 1948. How do you describe the conflict? What are the moral issues engaged here? It was very difficult. I could see it on their faces, struggling with it. I hope it was educational. We asked our Palestinian, David did the same with his group. And we tried to get them to agree on a joint narrative. And frankly, I knew from my own personal experience as a former negotiator that it's impossible to agree. My narrative is mine, and I can never compromise on it, and yours is yours, you can never compromise on it. But we want them to feel that while an agreement might not be possible, what is possible and what we should be doing is to actually be exposed to one another's narratives. To know that when David says, I love Jerusalem, he doesn't do it to undermine my love of Jerusalem. He actually does it because he loves Jerusalem, and vice versa. We wanted them to be sensitive to the issues, concerns, real fears, etc. from the other side. Now, I don't expect the students in my group, those who are self-identified as pro-Israel, to run tomorrow and start applying for jobs with the PLO. No. You're not trying to convert. You are trying to get everyone to approach their own interests and their own views with some more nuance, with some more complexity, and hopefully, in doing so, enable a real dialogue to continue, and hopefully when those guys become the next leaders, we might actually have peace. Thank you very much. Whether or not we failed or succeed, I think Wasim and Jake will tell us. Thank you for being here.
Good job.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nadine, and I was one of those students privileged enough to partake in the peace negotiations. Before I start, I would like to once again thank Leonard Wallach for bringing Gaith and David over. Fortunately, we had this experience last year, and I feel very privileged to have had the same experience again this year, and it was even better this year. I'd like to thank Professor Hecht for hosting this important and timely panel. So for me, what these peace negotiations did is it did something that doesn't happen enough here on campus, unfortunately. It addressed a need that we as students have needed to begin a dialogue. And unfortunately, I don't feel that students that lean pro-Israeli and that lean pro-Palestinian have come together enough on campus to discuss this critical issue. And we got to spend 9 hours in one room, 20 of us, discussing some of the very hot topics and addressing the two-state solution. 9 hours is very much speeding it up. As both David and Gaith know, these negotiations usually take weeks. So with that said, we did have to brush over a few things. We had to be very efficient with our time. But I do think that we each walked out with very valuable lessons. For me, I'd never realized how complex trying to reach a two-state solution is. I mean, when I look at maps like this, to be honest, it does give me a little bit of a headache. I'll be honest. All these names, I feel like I need a magnifying glass. But, through the process of negotiating, we built up this strong sense of trust between the two sides. And I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but as we walked into this room, one of the first instructions was that the pro-Israeli students, from then until the end of the negotiations, would become pro-Palestinian, and the pro-Palestinian students would take the Israeli side. And, I knew this going into the negotiations. A lot of the other participants probably didn't know that, and it probably came as a big shocker. It did for me last year. But, at first, when this happened to me last year, I was like, really? Like, am I going to really have to do this, And I was a little frustrated at first, just because I came ready to, try to convince the other side of, why Palestine needs to exist and, all these things. But, I realized that switching roles actually was much more effective in convincing the other side of some of, the Palestinian perspective than I personally could have done trying to convince them all day. So to me, it reiterated the importance of putting oneself in another's shoes. And we hear that often, but for me, this was a very strong reminder that especially within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis right now, that this is what we need to begin to do. Because ultimately, we have very similar goals. We have similar concerns for the future of our families abroad in Israel-Palestine, for the resolution of this conflict that has claimed many innocent lives. And in the end, I think that a root cause of a lot of the violence that's going on is fear. It's fear of the other, a deeply ingrained fear. We each have very, very traumatic narratives and histories, and there is that fear of the other. But as students, we're privileged to be separated from this conflict, thousands of miles away, and to be able to be, emotionally detached from a certain extent had allowed us to put aside these fears and come together. We also became really good, it was interesting because I felt like both sides were really good at reading the other side. Like, what was the other side's move going to be? Because quite honestly, it was what I would normally do as Nadine, So it was kind of interesting to see that happen. And I also try to, compare our experience to what the negotiators in real life really have to go through. Of course, money was not involved in our negotiations. So, there was no money in politics. It was very sped up, but it did give me a stronger sense of hope towards reaching a solution. My hope is that, through this experience, the students that were involved will take this back to their communities and emphasize the importance of, sustaining a productive dialogue and reaching out to the other side, because ultimately, it's within our hands. We're the future leaders, and I'm very thankful to have gone through this experience. And I'll pass it on to Jake.
Sure. I don't think that I could explain the experience of these past 9 hours more eloquently, but I guess I do have another perspective because I come from, the pro-Israeli perspective. Being a Reform Jew from Los Angeles, growing up, my uncle's a rabbi, always having this Jewish culture and element and this, love for Israel guiding my perspective of the conflict. Having the opportunity to come and, like you said, have this identity swap was probably one of the most challenging things that I can imagine not having to go through, but experiencing. But afterwards, I've kind of realized that it's the reason why I'm in college. And it's kind of like the point of being in this kind of institution is the fact that having a perspective that I've grown up with for 18 years. And having to change it 100% for the matter of this dialogue was incredible. What I really noticed was at the end of it today, when basically through this 3-day-long dialogue, we began with a lot of the, I guess, logical elements of the discussion of the conflict, such as borders or deciding exactly which settlements would go where. But today we brought up the emotional context, especially in regards to the fact that each side, the Palestinian and also the Israeli, would have to go back to their people. And every decision that they made would affect the identities of, hundreds of thousands to millions of people. And that was really difficult for me to say that, I caught myself covering my mouth today a lot because, like you mentioned, I would say something because I took the side of the Palestinian identity, and I would say I would never say that in the 18 years of my life. And this experience being able to delve into a solution that, we've kind of discuss after 3 days. I kind of think that this is now possible, which is uplifting. And at times I really wish that that there was some sort of possibility of this occurring in reality. I feel like what I've taken the most out of this experience is that, as you've mentioned, this is possible to kind of transcend just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this identity swap and dialogue and what Gaith and David have set up is something unbelievable. And in terms of spreading it to other campuses is something that I think is definitely necessary, but it's something also that sets UCSB apart. We are at an incredible institution because being in our little bubble right by the beach allows us to not have to deal with a lot of other organizations and institutions like what you would find in Los Angeles or New York or any other of these big cities. We have the ability to to have this dialogue be possible, and I'm really appreciative that we had this go on. Yeah, I'm yeah. I don't know.
I've been involved with this since the middle 70s in various roles, and I don't need to talk about that now, but I think one of the things that has left me wondering how you make that leap is the politicians themselves. Because this is one of the more brilliant experiences I've ever heard described, and I think it's wonderful what you're doing with students, and the idea of switching roles to develop empathy opens all sorts of abilities to negotiate. And the question is, how do you take it to the next level of getting to the policymakers and the politicians?
Actually, before I answer this, let me just say a couple of words about Jake and Wasim and everyone who was engaged in this. I think it took tremendous courage for every student who was in our exercise to be there. Personal courage to deal with some of their own perceptions and identities, but also courage in dealing with some of the pushback that I know many of them will get from some of their peers in some of their communities. And I think it is admirable, and I think it is up to us who are more established to continue to actually support and encourage and, if you wish, buffer this kind of exercise. Now, as to your question, what do we do with the politicians? And you are absolutely right. The issue now is not policy. We know what the policy options are, but it's the politicians and it's the politics. And in some ways in the Middle East, we had so far been very spoiled. We had been very spoiled by having politicians and leaders who were larger than life, who were willing to move beyond the public consensus and recreate the public consensus. I think of Sadat showing up in the Knesset. Now, that took courage. I think of Rabin. I think of Arafat, of whom I am actually a big critic, but what he did in Oslo. I think of Sharon. Again, I'm not very enamored with his past, but what he did in Gaza, changing the whole dynamic. So we got used to that. The problem is, in real life, regularly, generally speaking, these politicians do not come often. Politicians tend to be risk-averse players who look at cost-benefit analysis and tend to do the safe thing. If I look at the region, if I look at the regional map right now, I would say Abbas is that thing. Abbas is a risk-averse politician, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen of Palestine. Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is also a very risk-averse leader. And right now, there is no political logic for them. They are safe and comfortable where they are. They have strong coalitions, they have no real competition. The question becomes, how do you shift this cost-benefit analysis? There are many ways to do it. First of all, I would say, you need to start asking the leaders to actually not enforce the negative sentiments in their own publics. David and I are actually, fortuitously as it were, for us, are publishing something in the Washington Post this week, talking about how do you deal with messaging. It is no longer acceptable for a Palestinian leader to stand up and not recognize the Jewish connection to the land. It's no longer acceptable for an Israeli leader to stand up and not recognize some of the issues that are near and dear to the Palestinians' hearts. Because what they are doing is they're reinforcing their own people's bad interests, and they are actually making it more difficult for themselves to do what they need to do. That's one. Two, you need to start showing progress on the ground. People on the ground. Right now, you have a generation of Israelis who have only known Palestinians as potential suicide bombers, and Palestinians who have only known Israelis as soldiers at checkpoints. Neither side believes the other. We need the sides to start seeing that the Palestinians can be trusted with security, and the Israelis are interested and are willing to start deoccupying. Requires changes on the ground. We don't need more big pronouncements. We need small on-the-ground issues that will make people feel there is change. We need to make the sides, the leaders, behave responsibly in terms of what they say. And then there are many things that we can do as a country here in the United States. We can offer both sides incentive. One of the things that we did in the exercise is to say, okay, as you Palestinians and Israelis make these difficult concessions, how can we help you? As the US, I can push NATO to ensure that Israel becomes a member of NATO. I can get the Arab countries to come and support the Palestinians in what they are doing. We can do a lot to make the decisions easier. We cannot take the decisions for them. They have to do it. But we can create a sense of incentive and a disincentive of behaving in a certain way that will get us in the right direction. The one last point that I will say is, as we do that, it is very important not to overreach. If you push them to do too much too fast, one of two things will happen. The existing coalitions, whether it's the new Israeli government or the Palestinian, political coalitions that exist, either will break, creating chaos, or they will retrench into their positions, creating more hard lines. Right now, enough big gestures. Let us get on the ground. It's not as flashy. It's not going to get you a New York Times headline, but it might actually get something done.
Raith and I agree on this as well. if you want to distill, I think, the leadership criteria of these big leaders, the Rabins, the Anwar Sadat, or King Hussein, or Sharon in terms of the Gaza disengagement, Ben-Gurion, Begin, also with Sadat and Camp David. Four kind of qualities kind of repeat themselves, I would say. One is they needed usually to have some sort of strategic vision and a sense of national responsibility on their shoulders of where they felt the country needed to go. And they needed that sense of national vision to propel them above sectoral interests that at any step of the way would block them. So they needed a sense of vision. They needed a geopolitical set of circumstances that they could shape, exploit, utilize to get them to where they go. Sometimes that is a crisis. Sometimes it was an opportunity. The end of the Cold War, the end of the Gulf War led Rabin to his breakthrough. Two things. Third, they need political courage, often physical courage, because the obstacles were real. And indeed, two of these people that I mentioned paid for it with their lives, Rabin and Sadat. You might add maybe the first King Abdullah of Jordan in 1951, too, who was killed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem by a fanatic. So they needed a sense of courage, that they were determined to push forward, not just because they had a vision of where the country needed to go, but because they were going to challenge conventional wisdom in certain ways. They understood that negotiations, like we were talking here, and I think the students got that in the 9 hours, was not just a negotiation with the other side. It's like a chess table where you're playing multi-layer chess, because you're really negotiating. As you negotiate with the other side, you're negotiating with your own side. It's very easy to say tough things to the other side, no cost to that. But to say tough things to your own people of why the status quo is not good, that's hard. The fourth and final thing is each one of those guys had credibility. Often with security credentials, people needed to trust that if they said this needed to be done, these were people who had a lifetime of devotion to their national cause, that if they said so, they had a gravitas. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be critics. There would be critics, but for the bulk of the public, their motivations at least would not be suspect. So I think they needed those four things. That's greatness, in my view, in a Middle East thing. If you say, what gets you on the Middle East Mount Rushmore? Those are the four things that get you on the Mount Rushmore. Now, to pick up just one last point about what Raith said before, part of the problem here, and why we're so focused and we're writing this piece in the Washington Post, is that we are concerned about the poor state of public opinion in both camps, and a profound sense of disbelief which grips both publics, because we're dealing with, as Raith said, risk-averse politicians who are looking at cost-benefit analyses. For the most part, if they see that their publics are disengaged, they become disengaged. There's no price. And it's not about outside pressure of the United Nations or anybody else. The only pressure that's meaningful to these leaders is within. And therefore, when you look at the polling data, Israeli-Palestinian polls, what comes across is this. You ask people in the Israeli-Palestinian polls, almost a mirror image, do you want a two-state solution? Majorities still say, yes, I do. But then they ask the second question, does the other side want it? Oh, him? No way. Is it going to happen? Third question, never. Until we address that anomaly between each side saying they want two states, but they're convinced the other side doesn't want it, and therefore it won't happen, to us, that delta is leadership, about really synchronized political messaging and about really getting the publics to believe again, to deal with the things that are in their gut, what Jews might say in their kishkas, in their intestines, their fears. The Palestinians, you have to address the land piece of this. that you don't want to occupy, that you want them to have dignity as a state. That's crucial. And the narrative you have to address, the big fears on the Jewish side, is a belief of acceptance. That if you give the Palestinians what they want, is it over? Is the conflict really over and we can start anew? Or is it just the baseline for another round of conflict? Are they going to be accepted in the Middle East? You have to deal with these core gut fears of each side. That's critical in adjusting the cost-benefit analysis for these leaders. Thank you.
I think that's a great question, and just the importance of leadership. I think on both sides, the leadership really needs to reassess its legitimacy and make sure that it is in touch with its constituency. In Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, and in the West Bank, elections are long overdue. And if they want to legitimately represent the aspirations of Palestinians for self-determination, they are going to need to have elections. I think this is the best way of going about it. Also, for Palestinians, the refugees need to be represented. There are various methods of ways of going about that, but it is important and crucial that refugees are represented in any sort of peace deal. In Israel, there are elections. However, I think it's important that the Israeli leadership work on engaging the Palestinian Israeli minority within Israel. There's movements amongst the Palestinian population within Israel to boycott the Knesset, to boycott the elections. And I think that Israel needs to come up with ways to make sure that Palestinians are engaged with the election process, and perhaps are not as engaged due to maybe not feeling as welcome, being treated as second-class citizens to a certain extent. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Sure. And I mean, a conflict that we realized throughout these negotiations, not that we're, politicians or anything like that, but what we saw right away was that, our decisions, no matter how much we, they logically made sense or we agreed from the Palestinian and the Israeli perspective, there were some that simply were impossible based upon how deeply vested of interest some of the, constituents within our areas needed, what their needs were, and that was very difficult, because placed into the position of a politician, you know that something is morally right, you know that it is a decision that is, it's equal for both sides, but you can't do it because of whether it's extremists or just, like I said, the deeply rooted, the deeply vested interests of your people, which then again causes, some more difficulties.